For over 1,000 years, Vietnam defended its independence. Then foreign empires carved it apart, sparking a chain of resistance that would engulf the world. What began as a colonial struggle quickly became a flashpoint for Cold War superpowers, transforming villages into battlefields and ordinary people into symbols of a global crisis. But how did a fight on riverbanks and rice paddies spiral into decades of guerrilla war, secret bombings, political scandal, and a refugee exodus that still shapes our world? To understand the entire history of this conflict, we have to start centuries before the first American boots landed, where the roots of the Vietnam War run far deeper than most ever realize. In 938, Vietnamese forces led by Ngo Quyen stood at the mouth of the Bac Dong River, facing a fleet from the southern Han dynasty. Using wooden stakes hidden beneath the high tide, Ngo Quyen's men lured the invaders upriver. As the tide fell, the enemy ships ran aground, and the Vietnamese attacked. The victory at Bac Dong ended 1,000 years of Chinese domination and established Vietnam's independence. The new Ngo dynasty set up a centralized monarchy, drawing on Confucian ideals but adapting them to local needs. Authority came from the emperor, but villages kept their own councils and traditions, giving the people a sense of ownership and resilience that would shape Vietnamese identity for centuries. Over the next several hundred years, Vietnamese rulers defended their land against repeated invasions from the north. The kingdom, known as Dai Viet, expanded southward, absorbing Champa and pushing into the Mekong Delta. Each dynasty, from the Lai to the Tran, and later the Le, built on a system of strong central rule, with officials ranked by merit and local taxes collected to support the state. Villages maintained detailed records of land and property, and periodic redistributions ensured no single family could dominate for long. These systems set Vietnam apart from its neighbors and created a society where the idea of sovereignty ran deep. Even during periods of civil war and fragmentation, the dream of unity and independence never faded. Competing families, the Trinh in the north and the Nguyen in the south, fought for control, but the concept of a Vietnamese homeland endured. The Tay Son Rebellion of the late 1700s briefly united the country under peasant leaders before the Nguyen dynasty restored order in 1802. By the early 19th century, Vietnam was a highly organized, bureaucratic state, confident in its traditions and wary of outsiders. This long history of defending independence, building institutions, and balancing central power with local autonomy set the foundation for resistance when foreign empires arrived. The story of Vietnam's struggle would soon enter a new and dangerous era. French forces landed at Da Nang in 1858 and, over the next quarter century, pressed deeper into Vietnamese territory. By 1884, Vietnam had been carved into the colony of French Indochina, ruled from Hanoi and Saigon, and managed through a web of French officials and Vietnamese collaborators. The old imperial court was stripped of real power, and a new system of control took its place, one that prized profit above all else. Plantations spread across the lowlands, especially in the south. French and Vietnamese landlords, backed by colonial law, seized village lands for rubber, rice, and coffee. By the 1930s, more than 80% of farmland belonged to colonial interests or their local allies. Peasants who once tilled their own plots now worked as tenants or laborers, sometimes surrendering up to 60% of their harvest in rent. The French built irrigation canals and railways, but these projects served export markets, not the needs of the villages they cut through. Most Vietnamese saw little benefit from the new economy. Instead, they paid higher taxes on salt, alcohol, and opium, monopolies that filled colonial coffers but drained peasant pockets. In the rubber plantations of Cochinchina, workers faced brutal conditions. Overwork, disease, and abuse were common. Studies from the time recorded that a quarter of the plantation workforce died from exhaustion or neglect. Forced labor, corvée, remained a fact of life, with entire communities recruited for public works that rarely improved local lives. The French government in Paris debated these abuses, but little changed on the ground. Colonial rule also brought cultural domination. French became the language of government and education. Vietnamese history was sidelined and traditional institutions weakened. The colonial system offered no place for Vietnamese in business or politics, except for a small elite who served French interests. For most, the promise of modernity meant dispossession and hardship. By 1930, resistance took new forms. Ho Chi Minh and others founded the Indochinese Communist Party, uniting anti-colonial activists under a banner that promised not just independence, but the end of exploitation. As the world edged toward another war, the grievances born of colonial rule set the stage for a broader struggle, one that would soon draw in powers far beyond Vietnam's borders. Ho Chi Minh spent decades traveling the world before returning home. Born Nguyen Ai Quoc, he worked as a cook in Paris, a laborer in Boston, and a student in Moscow, learning from revolutionaries and sharpening his vision for an independent Vietnam. By the early 1940s, as war swept across Asia, he understood that national liberation would require more than ideology. It needed a broad front. In 1941, he gathered activists and founded the Viet Minh, a coalition that welcomed nationalists, communists, peasants, intellectuals, and anyone willing to resist foreign rule. The Viet Minh promised not just freedom from the French and Japanese, but land for farmers and dignity for the poor. Ho's speeches blended Marxist ideals with the language of Vietnamese patriotism. On September 2, 1945, standing in Ba Dinh Square, he declared the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He quoted the American Declaration of Independence, saying all men are created equal. The Creator has given us certain inalienable rights: the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to happiness. The crowd, many barefoot and hungry after years of occupation, erupted in applause. For them, this was not just rhetoric. It was a promise that the long struggle for self-rule might finally be won. Behind Ho stood Vo Nguyen Giap, a former school teacher turned strategist. Giap built the Viet Minh's military arm from scratch, training guerrillas who moved silently through forests and villages. Their tactics relied on popular support, discipline, and the belief that a small, determined force could outlast a foreign army. The Viet Minh's blend of nationalism and social reform drew strength from Vietnam's deep history of resistance, setting the stage for a new phase of confrontation with the colonial powers. Fighting erupted in December 1946 as French troops and Viet Minh forces clashed in the streets of Hanoi. What began as hit-and-run ambushes soon grew into a war that would stretch across villages, jungles, and cities for 8 relentless years. Vo Nguyen Giap, drawing on lessons from China and Vietnam's own history, turned small guerrilla bands into a disciplined army. Early Viet Minh victories depended on sabotage, night raids, and the support of villagers who hid fighters and carried supplies along hidden trails. French patrols faced ambushes on narrow roads and sabotage on railway lines, never knowing when the next attack would come. By 1949, the conflict had spread. The Viet Minh built bases along the northern border, supplied by China after the communist victory there. Giap began to concentrate his forces, launching set-piece battles for control of key towns and supply routes. The French responded with fortified outposts and mobile columns, but their lines stretched thin. Battles at Chao Bang, Hoa Binh, and along Route Coloniale 4 revealed the shifting balance. Each year, the Viet Minh's numbers grew, their weapons improved, and their tactics became more daring. Giap's strategy was simple but effective. Wear down the French with constant pressure, then strike hard at isolated garrisons. By 1953, the People's Army could field over 100,000 regulars, supported by hundreds of thousands more in local militia. The war's final act took shape in the remote valley of Dien Bien Phu, where Giap prepared to surround and besiege a major French force. The outcome would decide the fate of Vietnam and the future of colonial rule in Asia. In the spring of 1954, French commanders at Dien Bien Phu believed their fortress in the remote northwest would break the Viet Minh. Instead, Vo Nguyen Giap's forces hauled heavy artillery through jungle and mud, surrounding the valley and cutting off every supply route. For nearly 2 months, French troops endured relentless bombardment and trench assaults, trapped as monsoon rains turned their positions into a mire. Ammunition and food ran low. Paratroopers dropped in by night, but nothing could reverse the siege. On May 7, 1954, the French garrison surrendered. Over 10,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. The defeat sent shockwaves through Paris and across the colonial world. As the guns fell silent at Dien Bien Phu, diplomats gathered in Geneva to decide the fate of Indochina. Negotiators from France, the Viet Minh, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and the United States faced a deadlock. Ho Chi Minh's representatives demanded national elections and full independence. French officials, weakened by military collapse, sought a way out that would preserve some influence. American and Soviet delegates pressed their own agendas, wary of a wider Cold War escalation. On July 21, 1954, the Geneva Accords drew a temporary line at the 17th parallel. The Viet Minh would withdraw north, and the French and their allies would withdraw south. National elections to reunite Vietnam were scheduled for 1956, but no mechanism guaranteed they would take place. The agreement was meant as a stopgap, but it created two rival states, North and South Vietnam, each claiming legitimacy. The colonial era in Vietnam ended, but the struggle for the country's future had only entered a new phase, shaped now by global powers and the deep scars of war. South of the 17th parallel, a new government took shape in 1955 under Ngo Dinh Diem. He declared the Republic of Vietnam, rejecting the planned national elections that the Geneva Accords had set for 1956. Diem, a Catholic in a mostly Buddhist country, built his authority around family loyalty, anti-communist rhetoric, and strong backing from the United States. American aid flowed in, money, supplies, and a growing number of military advisors propping up the fragile state. Diem's regime tried to construct a modern bureaucracy, but power often remained in the hands of his relatives and trusted allies. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, became the backbone of the new state. American advisors trained officers, supplied equipment, and shaped doctrine, but the ARVN struggled with low morale and corruption. Many soldiers came from rural backgrounds, uneasy with their orders and suspicious of Saigon's distant leaders. The South's political institutions never gained deep roots. Diem cracked down on opposition, jailing rivals and censoring the press. His government launched ambitious programs to resettle peasants and root out communist influence in the countryside, but these efforts often alienated the very people they aimed to win over. Village chiefs were replaced with loyalists, and land reform faltered. Without the promise of elections, and with communist cadres organizing quietly in the Mekong Delta and Central Highlands, the South's position grew more precarious. The ARVN depended on American support to maintain order, while the government in Saigon relied on United States aid to function. Each year, more American advisors arrived, drawn into a web of local disputes and insurgent attacks. The foundations of South Vietnam looked solid on paper, but beneath the surface, cracks were already spreading. August 2nd, 1964. The destroyer USS Maddox cruised through the warm waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the North Vietnamese coast. 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats closed in fast, firing torpedoes and machine guns. The Maddox answered with its 5-inch guns and called in air support. The skirmish lasted less than half an hour. The Maddox was barely scratched, but the White House received the news as an act of aggression. 2 days later, reports came in of a second attack, radar blips and sonar pings in the darkness, torpedoes supposedly in the water. But the weather was rough and the evidence was thin. Captain Herrick on the scene doubted anything had happened at all. Still, the message sent to Washington spoke of enemy action. President Johnson moved quickly. On August 7th, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The vote was nearly unanimous, 416-0 in the House, 88-2 in the Senate. The resolution handed Johnson sweeping authority to use military force in Southeast Asia, all without a formal declaration of war. The legal door was now open. Within months, the war changed shape. In March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began. American bombers unleashed a torrent of explosives on North Vietnam. Over 1 million tons dropped in the years that followed. The goal was to cut off support for the Southern insurgency and convince Hanoi to back down. Instead, resistance hardened. That same month, the first U.S. combat troops landed at Da Nang. Marines stepped onto Vietnamese soil, no longer just as advisors, but as active fighters. By the end of 1965, more than 200,000 American soldiers were in country. The conflict had become a ground war, with U.S. policymakers now fully committed. Decisions made in Washington echoed through the jungles and villages of Vietnam, setting in motion a long and costly struggle. North Vietnam's ability to withstand American bombing and keep its armies in the field depended on more than determination alone. Behind the scenes, 2 communist giants, China and the Soviet Union, poured weapons, supplies, and expertise into Hanoi. In the early years, China sent hundreds of thousands of engineering troops across the border. These soldiers did not fight on the front lines, but their work was essential. They repaired roads and bridges, built anti-aircraft positions, and kept the railways running under constant attack. At the height of their involvement, as many as 320,000 Chinese personnel rotated through North Vietnam, often living in tents and bunkers just miles from the fighting. Soviet support arrived in the form of high-tech firepower. Soviet cargo ships unloaded crates of MiG-17 and MiG-21 jet fighters at Haiphong Harbor. Soviet advisors trained North Vietnamese pilots to fly these jets, which soon filled the skies over Hanoi. As American bombers thundered south, Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile batteries waited in hidden launch sites. By 1967, nearly every major city and industrial site in the north was protected by a ring of Soviet missiles and radar, creating one of the densest air defense networks in the world. Soviet technicians worked side by side with Vietnamese crews, teaching them how to track and shoot down U.S. planes. In the air, American pilots quickly learned to fear the telltale smoke trails of the Soviet-made SA-2 missile. The rivalry between Moscow and Beijing also shaped the flow of aid. Each superpower tried to outdo the other, sending more guns, trucks, and tons of ammunition in a contest for influence over the North's war effort. Hanoi's leaders played these tensions to their advantage, securing the resources they needed to keep fighting. In the jungles and on the roads, this aid meant the difference between holding out or being overrun. The weapons, fuel, and expertise from China and the Soviet Union turned North Vietnam from an isolated state into a fortress, able to absorb the full force of America's military might and continue the struggle for reunification. In the thick forests outside Saigon, American patrols moved cautiously, wary of ambushes that could come from anywhere or nowhere at all. Beneath their boots, a hidden world stretched for hundreds of miles, the tunnels of Cu Chi. Dug by hand, sometimes with little more than shovels and baskets, these narrow passageways formed a vast underground network, over 150 miles in the Cu Chi district alone. Some ran just below the surface. Others plunged deep, connecting command posts, field hospitals, weapons caches, and entire living quarters. Ventilation shafts poked up through termite mounds. Trapdoors, camouflaged with leaves, vanished beneath a single step. For the Viet Cong, these tunnels were lifelines, sheltering fighters from bombs and patrols, and letting them strike and disappear almost at will. American commanders quickly realized that air power and artillery meant little against an enemy who could vanish underground. Units were assigned to root out these networks, sending soldiers known as tunnel rats into the darkness. One veteran described inching through a pitch-black tunnel barely wider than his shoulders, pistol in one hand, flashlight in the others, every sense straining for the scrape of a shoe or the click of a booby trap. Sometimes he found sleeping quarters lined with straw mats. Other times he crawled into a dead end or a flooded chamber, the air thick with humidity and fear. The tunnels were filled with dangers, spikes, snakes, even scorpions planted as living traps. But the greatest threat was the unseen enemy who might be waiting just around the bend. Above ground, U.S. forces tried to destroy the tunnels with explosives, bulldozers, and chemicals, but the networks kept coming back. The Viet Cong rebuilt by night, shifting entrances and digging deeper. Supplies, including food, weapons, and even bicycles, moved through these hidden corridors, keeping fighters armed and fed despite the constant pressure from American patrols and bombers. Far to the west, another invisible artery kept the war going: the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This network of roads and footpaths snaked through Laos and Cambodia, bypassing the main battle lines. Trucks, porters, and bicycles carried rice, ammunition, and fresh troops south, often under the cover of jungle canopy. U.S. bombers dropped millions of tons of explosives trying to cut the trail, but the flow never stopped for long. At its peak, the trail moved thousands of tons of supplies each month, fueling the fight in the south. The combination of underground tunnels and the sprawling Ho Chi Minh Trail allowed the North and the Viet Cong to strike unexpectedly, regroup, and launch attacks on a scale few in Washington believed possible. These hidden networks made it clear technology alone would not win the war, and the battlefield was as much beneath the surface as above it. On the night of January 30th, 1968, while much of South Vietnam celebrated the Lunar New Year, bursts of gunfire echoed across the country. More than 85,000 North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong fighters launched a wave of surprise attacks on over 100 cities and military targets, including the United States Embassy in Saigon. For weeks, American commanders had insisted the enemy was too weak for such an assault. Yet in a single night, the war's front lines seemed to vanish. Streets once thought secure became battlegrounds. In Hue, fighting raged for nearly a month, leaving much of the city in ruins. United States and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the attackers, inflicting heavy losses, tens of thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed or captured. But the shock was not in the casualty count. It was in the images that flooded American living rooms. Firefights outside the embassy, wounded soldiers, chaos in the heart of Saigon. The Tet Offensive spread quickly from military reports to nightly news broadcasts. Reporters described the surprise and scale, challenging official claims of progress. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in American media, traveled to Vietnam and returned with a blunt assessment. The war now looked unwinnable. Public confidence crumbled. Polls taken after Tet showed support for the war had dropped sharply. Gallup data recorded a swing from 56% backing the effort in January to just 42% weeks later. The credibility gap between government statements and battlefield reality became impossible to ignore. Barely a month after Tet, another event would deepen the sense of crisis. On March 16, 1968, a unit of American soldiers entered the hamlet of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. Over the next several hours, they killed hundreds of unarmed civilians, men, women, children, even infants. Survivors described scenes of terror and confusion. The massacre was covered up for more than a year before investigative reporters and whistleblowers forced the story into the open. When the facts became public, outrage swept across the United States and the world. My Lai became a symbol of the war's moral cost, raising questions about discipline, leadership, and the purpose of the conflict itself. The combined impact of Tet and My Lai reached far beyond the battlefield. The war, once presented as a struggle for freedom and stability, now appeared as a quagmire with no clear end. Television and newspapers became powerful actors, shaping how millions understood the conflict. The images, the stories, and the statistics sparked anger, grief, and doubt. In the months that followed, protest movements would swell, and political leaders would face growing pressure to find a way out. By the summer of 1969, the mood in America was changing. Across college campuses and city streets, crowds gathered with handmade signs and chants that echoed for blocks. One protester, a Vietnam veteran named Ron, stood on the steps of the Capitol with his uniform jacket draped over his arm. He spoke quietly to a reporter, saying that he had fought in the Delta, that he had seen what happened, and that they needed to bring their boys home. Ron's story was just one among millions. In 1967, a single rally in Washington drew more than 100,000 people. By 1970, protests had erupted in hundreds of cities, fueled by news reports that no longer matched the government's optimistic claims. Trust in official statements had already begun to erode after the Tet Offensive and the My Lai revelations. Then in June 1971, the ground shifted again. The New York Times published a secret government study known as the Pentagon Papers. Over 7,000 pages of classified documents leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, a former Defense Department analyst. The papers revealed that United States leaders had doubted the war's progress for years, even as they promised victory to the public. Decisions to expand the conflict, to bomb Cambodia, and to send more troops had been made in private, shielded from Congress and the American people. The impact was immediate. Court battles raged over press freedom, but the story was out. Polls showed support for the war collapsing, and congressional hearings demanded answers. For many, The Pentagon Papers confirmed what the protesters had been shouting all along, that the war was not only costly, but built on broken promises. As the credibility gap widened, pressure mounted on leaders in Washington to find an exit. The voices from the streets and the revelations in print made it clear the will to fight was fading, and the search for peace could no longer be ignored. Peace arrived on paper before it ever reached the battlefield. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed by the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all U.S. combat troops within 60 days, and the return of prisoners of war. In theory, both North and South Vietnam would remain divided at the 17th parallel until a peaceful reunification could be negotiated. But there was little trust left. Even as the last American soldiers boarded planes home in March, North Vietnamese units quietly shifted men and supplies south, ignoring the spirit of the treaty. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, now fighting alone, struggled to hold its ground as U.S. aid dwindled. In the spring of 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a final, sweeping offensive. Cities fell in rapid succession, including Banh Mi Thuot, Hue, and Da Nang. Panic spread through the streets of Saigon. Families packed what they could carry, crowding the roads south. ARVN soldiers, exhausted and outnumbered, abandoned their posts or tried to blend into the civilian masses. On April 29th, the sound of White Christmas played over Armed Forces radio, the signal for Americans and select South Vietnamese to get to evacuation points. Helicopters lifted off from the U.S. Embassy roof throughout the night, ferrying nearly 7,000 people to waiting ships offshore. Outside the embassy gates, desperate crowds pressed forward, waving papers and pleading for a place on the last flights out. A South Vietnamese schoolteacher, clutching her daughter's hand, watched the helicopters disappear, knowing there would be no more. At dawn on April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. The South's government surrendered unconditionally. After 3 decades of war, Vietnam was unified at last, but the cost would haunt generations. The cost of the Vietnam War can be measured in numbers, but its true impact reaches much deeper. Official U.S. records list 58,220 American service members killed and over 150,000 wounded. For Vietnam, the toll is staggering. Historians estimate between 1.5 and 3.8 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians lost their lives. The war's violence did not stop at the border. In Laos and Cambodia, millions more were displaced or killed as bombs rained down on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and nearby villages. Beyond the battlefield, the war left a toxic legacy. From 1961 to 1971, American planes sprayed more than 20 million gallons of herbicides, including Agent Orange, across the countryside. Fields, forests, and entire villages were doused with chemicals meant to deny cover to enemy fighters. The consequences lasted generations. Vietnamese families reported birth defects, cancers, and unexplained illnesses, problems echoed by U.S. veterans who served in sprayed areas. The Department of Veterans Affairs now recognizes more than a dozen diseases linked to Agent Orange exposure, and studies by the Institute of Medicine have confirmed the risks for both Vietnamese and Americans. After the fall of Saigon, a new crisis unfolded. More than 1 million people fled Vietnam in the years that followed, risking everything in small, overcrowded boats. Many never made it, lost to storms, pirates, or hunger at sea. For those who survived, refugee camps in Malaysia, Thailand, and Hong Kong became temporary homes before resettlement in the United States, Canada, Australia, and France. One survivor, a former teacher from the Mekong Delta, recalled her escape. "We left at night with only what we could carry. I held my son close and prayed the waves would not take us. When we reached land, I cried because we were alive." These numbers and stories are more than statistics. They are the measure of a conflict whose scars remain, woven into the lives of millions across continents. The Vietnam War's legacy lives on, in the millions still affected by unexploded ordnance, in the scars carried by veterans and refugees, and in every debate over military intervention today. As new conflicts draw superpowers into distant lands, hard lessons remain unheeded. History doesn't repeat, but its echoes shape every choice we make. If you found this history documentary interesting, check out our World War II film now on screen, and let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.